That's it. Happy Sabbath. I'm going to give you some portions of what I've been looking at recently tonight and tomorrow, Lord willing. But I think everyone, I was kind of halfway watching your feedback to Brother Tabot. It seems like everyone was up to speed with all the concepts he was using, right? I see one, no, okay. Do we understand that this 25 from midnight to the midnight cry, it's also accomplished in here for the Levites? Yeah. Okay. Do we understand that if you view the Levites and the priests together as the first fruit, that the 25 would go from here to here? Okay, so yes, amen. All right, I've been looking recently at a history that I've come to understand begins in 1784 and goes to 1789, which is 25 years. And in that history, there are two revolutions. There's a revolution in the United States and there's a revolution in France. And both of these histories get repeated in the history of the last president of the United States, which is the 45th president of the United States. Both of these histories, the history of the French Revolution and the history of the American Revolution. The American Revolution is the beginning of the glorious land. The French Revolution is the end of the glorious land. If you read carefully passages that you've already read and you look for it, you'll realize that the same privilege that was given to the United States was given to France. France was to be the glorious land in Europe during the Protestant Reformation, but France rejected that opportunity. So when you get to the French Revolution, you are seeing illustrated the judgment that will take place upon the glorious land that is the United States in the very near future. But in that very same history, you have the revolution in the United States. So you got two witnesses of two revolutions that are pretty much take place in the same history. Okay, so as I've been trying to grapple with these ideas, some of the things that I have been looking for are 1789 as one example. What took place in 1789? Because 1789 becomes a year that is a very significant prophetic year that is illustrating what takes place at the end of time. So if you're going to refer to 1789 as a waymark in prophecy, you're going to have two or three witnesses, right, to establish it. So part of what I've been trying to pull together are these witnesses, and there are several. So I'm going to try to take you through a study where one of these gets established, one of these witnesses to 1789 gets established fairly soundly. But it's also going to be based upon a concept that is already in place in this message, and I'll check and see if we're up to speed. And I understand the sister, you must be a little bit new, right? Okay, so you got the blessing that the Holy Spirit's willing to work very hard with you if you will apply yourself, and you can come up to speed really quick. That's a nice blessing to be able to take hold of. But at one level, we can show that Brother Tabot was telling us that this is the first Sunday law. This is the Sunday law in the United States, but this is the Sunday law that initiates the Sunday law crisis that leads to the Sunday law, right? This is the image of the beast testing time. So there's a Sunday law here, and he was showing that there's a Sunday law here. He doesn't say it that way, but there's some kind of attack on the law of God here that is typifying this Sunday law, that's typifying this Sunday law, that is typifying the universal Sunday law down here. Okay, we're all following that logic, right? But do we understand that from here to here that this is a siege? This is the destruction of Jerusalem. He referred to it here. But AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem is preceded by the siege back here in AD 66. Everyone up to speed on that? This is Cestius and this is Titus. Or this is Cestius and this is Titus. Or this is Cestius and this is Titus. Okay? Fractals do a number of things, but I went through and began looking at the sieges of Jerusalem, the sieges in the scriptures. So that's what we're going to go through here tonight. And I'm going to try to get to the siege of Hoshea, or Hoshea, however you pronounce that. And have you looked closely at that siege? It's a very nice place to establish 1989. Okay, so that's the purpose here of what we're going to look at tonight. Most of this is already a matter of public record. I hate to be redundant with you, but when we get to Hosea, some of this won't be a matter of public record if we can get that far. So I have 1 hour. Is that right? Okay, so I'm going by that clock back there. All right, so we didn't have a printer. I was going to print out notes. And if I would have printed out notes for you, it would have been a blessing. But it would have even been a blessing if I had my own notes. I think this is almost the first time I've ever worked off a computer, so I'm going to be kicking things around a little bit probably. Because like on this one, I'm going to have to drop down a page or two. This is from Great Controversy, page 27 through... Pardon me?
It's supposed to be your notes or something.
How did you know what notes I was going to be using? Are they the right notes? How could they possibly be the right notes? Oh, no. These are okay notes, but this isn't what I'm dealing with. In Great Controversy, page 27, 29 through 31 is where you have the classic passage that we're all familiar with about what takes place in the destruction of Jerusalem. I'm going to take some snippets out of each paragraph because there's about 6 or 8 paragraphs here and I don't want to spend the time reading it all the way through it. Okay, it begins with saying the Jews had built up Jerusalem with blood. Okay, they're about ready to be judged for their rejection of Christ, rejection of truth. An important observation, I think, in this is the next sentence, the next paragraph, which begins this way. It says, "For nearly 40 years after the doom of Jerusalem had been pronounced by Christ himself, the Lord delayed his judgments upon the city and the nation." The reason I point that out is we here have a warning of 40 years that leads to the destruction of Jerusalem. There's a warning 40 years in advance, and we know that Jerusalem was destroyed in the time of Zedekiah. And Sister White says that Jeremiah gave a warning message to Jerusalem for how many years before the destruction of Jerusalem? For 40 years. So this 40-year warning of Christ has been typified by the 40-year warning of Jeremiah that both lead to the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? So I'm going to drop down to the next couple paragraphs. It says, "Signs and wonders appeared, foreboding disaster and doom. In the midst of the night, an unnatural light shone over the temple and altar. Upon the clouds at sunset were pictured chariots of men of war gathering for battle. The priests ministering by night in the sanctuary were terrified by mysterious sounds. The earth trembled, and a multitude of voices were heard crying, 'Let us depart hence.' The great eastern gate, which was so heavy that it could hardly be shut by a score of men, and which was secured by immense bars of iron fastened deep in the pavement of solid stone, opened at midnight without visible agency." Okay? Now, I have a thought on this next paragraph that all of us in here have read, the next 2 paragraphs actually. I've heard this discussed, and there is no, I don't have an answer. Okay, I'm not suggesting I have an answer. But I'm approaching this differently now than I've ever approached it before, and I'm not sure that what I'm going to say is correct, but it makes pretty good sense to me. All right, so you'll be familiar with this paragraph I'm going to read in a moment, but before we do, I want to just turn this into an illustration of a siege up here, so we all know that that's what I'm presenting here. And I could left the 80-70 up there. But I'm going to say this is AD 66. This is 70. This is Titus. This is Cestius. And that this is the siege, this is the destruction, and that all the sieges and destructions in the scriptures that go to identify the history of between these two waymarks, this piece of history, whether you apply it from midnight to midnight cry or midnight cry to the Sunday law, that they're going to possess these characteristics that come from all the sieges in the scriptures line up on line. Okay? And the next thing I'm going to read doesn't really have a great deal to do with that, but now that we know that this is the siege and this is the destruction, it changes how you can approach this next paragraph. And the next paragraph says, "For 7 years a man continued to go up and down the streets of Jerusalem, declaring that the woes that were to come upon the city. By day and by night he chanted the wild dirge, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and against the temple, a voice against the bridegroom and the brides, a voice against the whole people." And when you read that again on your own time, if you go back and check this out, notice that the first three voices, it's telling you where it's coming from, and then it's telling you what these voices are against in the last four references. There's something there. I'm not claiming to know how to apply that, but there's something purposeful there, a distinction. It says, "This strange being was in prison and scourged, but no complaint escaped his lips. To insult and abuse he answered only, 'Woe, woe to Jerusalem, woe, woe to the inhabitants thereof.' His warning cry ceased not until he was slain in the siege that he foretold." Now this matters to you and I as student of prophecies, because how long was he prophesying? So does his 7 years end here at this siege, or does it go all the way to here with the destruction of Jerusalem? See, we really don't have that information here. I would argue we don't have that information. If his prophecy began back here, and he's predicting this siege and he dies here, then we don't have the discussion about the very next sentence in the very next paragraph, which says, and you all know this one, right? Not one Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. Was this guy not a Christian? Or was he a Christian? Now, I know you can go either way, but usually we argue that no, he wasn't a Christian. So how was he giving a prophetic message that was this accurate, that was fulfilled? Who was inspiring him? And you got to go into the realms of maybe this was Satan or whatever. But I'm saying if you take it at our words, that he died at the siege. He died right here. And not one Christian died down here 3.5 years later in Jerusalem. He may very well have been a genuine Christian prophet that gave a message for 7 years prior to AD 66. But I don't have a second witness for that. But until we got to the point to where we could see the siege and the destruction, we didn't even have the possibility of inserting that thought in here. All right? So I'm leaving that up in the air. That isn't where I'm heading. I'm going to drop down further into that paragraph about not one Christian dying in the destruction of Jerusalem. At the time of the siege, the Jews were assembled at Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, and thus the Christians throughout the land were able to make their escape unmolested. Without delay, they fled to a place of safety, the city of Pella in the land of Perea beyond Jordan. One of the things that we've been looking at is this sign the Christians have to see right here. And this is a sign for Christians. And perhaps tomorrow in one of the presentations as we go through the signs, I intend to do that, Lord willing. The sign of Jonah was not a sign for the Christians. If you're going to take the references in the New Testament, that was a sign for a wicked and adulterous generation. Okay? And the sign is the preaching of Jonah in his time period, or the preaching of John the Baptist, or the preaching of Christ in their time period. The sign was the preaching that was the only hope for the wicked and adulterous Seventh-day Adventists. They had to see this preaching for what it was and accept it for what it was in order to be awakened out of their Laodicean condition. Okay? This sign was for the non-sanctified persons in the Advent movement at the end of the world, whereas the abomination of desolation, it is a sign that you and I are required to see, and we have to respond accordingly. So there's some distinctions between the various signs. Putting that in the record, that is still not the purpose of this presentation, but it's connected to it. So Cestius comes at the Feast of Tabernacles. Titus is going to return at Passover. Sister White says, terrible were the calamities that fell upon Jerusalem when the siege was resumed by Titus. The city was invested at the time of Passover when millions of Jews were assembled in the walls. And what I want you to see here is that the siege begins at Tabernacles and it ends at Passover. But it took how long from AD 66 to AD 70? What does that equate to? Exactly 3.5 years. Okay, which is 1260 days. It's exactly, let me read you a couple. If you put this in your notes, look at Leviticus 23:34 and chapter 25, verse 3, and you'll get the references to when you were supposed to observe tabernacles and Passover. And you can do the math, and you'll see that they're exactly 6 months apart. And how many days are in a biblical month? 30. 6 times 30 is 180 on top of 3 years. What's 3 years? It's 360 times 3, which is 1080, plus 180 equals 1260, right? Okay, let me read you something that is from a handbook for Bible students. It's an Adventist publication. There is no person that wrote it. It's just something that in the past Adventist Bible workers would consider. And you know what? I don't have that in here. Oh yeah, I do here. It was during the Feast of Tabernacles in the year AD, in 66 AD, that Cestius Gallus came up to assault Jerusalem. The dates are so precise that we can exactly assign the several transactions to their proper days in the Julian calendar. It was in the year 70, and at the Passover, the 13th of April, when multitudes of Jews from all parts of the world were gathered into Jerusalem for the feast, and precisely 3.5 Jewish years from the Feast of Tabernacles, at which Cestius came up, that Titus and the Roman armies arrived before Jerusalem. So 1,260 days in between these two waymarks, the siege, the destruction, and suddenly this 1260 becomes one of the characteristics of this period of time between the siege and the destruction. And we gather this one from the destruction in Jerusalem in AD 70. Let me drop down to another siege now. And let me add one component here that you're all familiar with, I imagine, in this room. This is Prophets and Kings, page 714. God's church was as verily in captivity during this long period of relentless persecution as were the children of Israel held captive in Babylon during the period of their exile. How long were they in Babylon? 70 years. There's a 1260 in here. What's this 1260 equate to? There's a 70 in here. Okay. From Prophets and Kings, page 408, this is something I referenced a minute ago. For 40 years, Jeremiah was to stand before the nations as a witness for truth and righteousness. In a time of unparalleled apostasy, he was to exemplify in life and character the worship of the only true God. The next sentence I want you to listen to closely, because you don't have it in front of you. During the terrible sieges, plural, of Jerusalem, he was to be the mouthpiece of Jehovah. He was to predict the downfall of the house of David and the destruction of the beautiful temple built by Solomon. And when imprisoned because of his fearless utterances, he was still to speak plainly against sin in high places. Before this siege and destruction, Christ's prophecy of warning was 40 years in the coming, and so too in the destruction of Jerusalem during the time period of Zedekiah. And Jeremiah is given a warning for 40 years. That isn't an accident. But in Jeremiah's time period, it's sieges in the plural. Okay? In Prophets and Kings 4:22, she's going to give us the definition of what these sieges in the plural were. She says, within a few short years, the king of Babylon was to be used as the instrument of God's wrath upon impenitent Judah. Again and again, Jerusalem was to be invested and entered by the besieging armies of Nebuchadnezzar. Company after company. And when does Nebuchadnezzar first come to Jerusalem? This is just checking our historical understanding. Who's the king when he comes in? Pardon me? Jehoiahaz, right? Because he's going to replace him. Right, so who's he replace him with? Jehoiakim. Eliakim, and he changed his name to Jehoiakim. From Jehoiakim, I'll mark Jehoiakim here just for a point of reference, and to Zedekiah, how many years? 23 years. But my point is that the first siege here, in the time period of Jehoiakim, is going to be followed by 2 more sieges. There's going to be 3 sieges in here, and she's going to tell us which ones they are in this paragraph. Company after company, at first a few only, but later on thousands and 10,000s were to be taken captive to the land of Shinar, there to dwell in enforced exile. Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, Zedekiah, all these Jewish kings were in turn to become vassals of the Babylonian ruler, and all in turn were to rebel. Severe and yet more severe chastisements were to be inflicted upon the rebellious nation until at last the entire land was to become a desolation. Jerusalem was to be laid waste and burned with fire. The temple that Solomon had built was to be destroyed. All of you probably have the Ellen White CD-ROM, right? Most of you. Say amen if you have it. Okay, you know you can go into the historical writings and you can look up a guy named Edersheim, I think is his name. Edersheim. Yep. I forget his first name, but he got a very nice biblical history in there that's worth referring to from time to time. It'll fill in some clues. And I was looking at it recently, and it never clicked on me till I read it from him. Maybe all of you know this. But Daniel, in the first captivity, or in the first siege, he's going to get carried away captive. He's among the first. They didn't take very many people then. You know, Nebuchadnezzar hears about his father dying. He's got to race home, whatever. He didn't take many people at that time. But in the time of Jehoiachin, the second siege, how many people did he take? Almost everyone, and all the political leadership and all the wealthy men. What was left in Jerusalem was the poor people, but virtually nothing. And until that clicks on for you, you don't really see, I didn't really see how foolish Zedekiah was. Here's this last king, and his kingdom is gone. He doesn't have any civilians to tax anymore to meet any needs. He's already bankrupt by the time you get there. And he's still acting the way he acted towards Jeremiah in his rebellious attitude. I never realized how empty Jerusalem was after the second carrying away by Jehoiachin. And Edersheim will fill that in for you nicely if you haven't seen that before either. Okay, so now I'm at a point where I want to go into the story of Josiah. Okay, and this is also a matter of public record, and I think we have time to do this, but I'm going to have to go back and forth. The prediction about Josiah. Everyone know that story? That's the disobedient prophet. You know the story of the disobedient prophet? He comes to Jeroboam when Jeroboam is instituting the golden calf worship in Israel, and he rebukes Jeroboam for doing so. That took place. That disobedience showed up at 977. Okay. Somebody knows these dates. I heard someone say it out there, so as we walk through this, you might save me some work of having to go back and forth. When was that fulfilled? It was fulfilled in 627. Okay. And that's 350 years later. And then Josiah is going to have a Passover in 622. We won't have time for that, but from 627 until 587 is how many years? Too much subtraction and stuff this late in the... It's 40 years, isn't it? Okay. And the prediction that is given in Ezekiel 4, having Ezekiel lay on his right side and then having lay on his left side, takes place in 592. And the siege begins in 587. And I put 587 over there. The destruction is in 586. Everyone familiar with this history? Okay, if you're taking notes, I'm going to give you some scriptures real quick so you can put them in your notes, and then we'll go back and discuss them. Okay? This here, this is 1 Kings 13, verses 1 through 5, when the disobedient prophet comes and rebukes Jeroboam and gives the prophecy about the Lord raising up Josiah. Okay? 1 Kings 13, 1 through 5. This here, the fulfillment of when Josiah is raised up and he's doing this work in 627, is in 2 Kings 23, verses 15 through 18. Okay? I got to, pardon me? If you're not following me, just say so and I'll repeat it. 2 Kings 23, verses 15 through 18. 622 BC, the Passover of Josiah, is 2 Chronicles 35, verse 18 and 19. The prediction of the siege by Ezekiel is in Ezekiel 4, 1 through 7. Let's read that. Ezekiel 4, 1 through 7. I'll give you the other references in a moment. You know this passage as a Seventh-day Adventist well. This is where you go to teach the year-day principle, one of the two places. And in chapter 4, it says, "Thou also, son of man," verse 1, "take thee a tile and lay it before thee, and portray upon it the city, even Jerusalem, and lay siege against it." So this is about him acting out the siege of Jerusalem. "And build a fort against it, and cast a mount against it, and set the camp also against it, and set battering rams against it round about. Moreover, take thou unto thee an iron pan, and set it for a wall of iron between thee and the city, and set thy face against it, and it shall be besieged, and thou shalt lay siege against it. This shall be a sign unto the house of Israel." What's the siege? It's a sign to the house of Israel. Okay, the second witness to the teaching about the abomination of desolation, because the abomination of desolation sign was fulfilled at the siege of AD 66 with Cestius. So this is the siege back here in the first destruction of Jerusalem. It is also marked as a sign. And you got two witnesses saying that you and I need to know what this sign is at the end of the world, because all the prophets are speaking about the end of the world more than their own history. Okay, so verse 4 of Ezekiel 4 says, Lie thou also upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it, according to the number of days that thou shalt lie on it, thou shalt bear their iniquity. Verse 5, for I have laid the years of their iniquity according to the number of days, 390 days, so shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. Who's Israel? It's the northern tribe. And he's going to illustrate 390 days, which equates to 390 years of the final time period of the northern kingdom. This whole story begins back here in 977 BC. Okay? And if you go from here, 390 years later, you come to the siege. You follow the point here? Now, in order to follow the point, one of the things I want you to understand what we're doing here, when you get to this siege, whether it be the siege that we mark at the midnight cry, or the siege that we mark at midnight, or the siege we mark at the Sunday law, right? You following my thought? One of the things you're going to know is that this siege here was predicted. It's predicted by Jeremiah or Ezekiel. He's setting it forth, but the prophecy begins back here, and it concludes at the siege. So what does it tell you about this history? This history here is going to be repeated down here at the siege. So what we know about this history, because Jesus illustrates the end with the beginning, this history here in the story of the disobedient prophet rebuking Jeroboam for the image of the beast. So this is what Jeroboam's illustrating, isn't it? He's going to put two places of worship up, one in Bethel, one in Dan. Bethel, church; Dan, judgment; church and state, combination of church and state. He's going to build a golden calf for each of them. It's an image of the beast. So here, the disobedient prophet is rebuking Jeroboam for the image of the beast. So down here, whenever this siege arrives, the issue of the image of the beast is going to be alive and well. Is the issue of the image of the beast going to take place at midnight? Yes, it is. What about the midnight cry? Yes, it is. What about the Sunday law? Yes, it is. That's where the image beast test for the 11th hour workers begin. So the components of this history are reaching their conclusion here at the siege, and this is telling us that when we deal with the siege prophetically, we need to take these characteristics and bring them here. And what does that tell you about that story? What is one of the components of the siege that's manifested right here? There's going to be a disobedient prophet on the scene.
That 40 years needs to be back.
586.
Number 40 is fully back.
Good for you. All right. Sorry about that. I hope you didn't miss my point. But my point is not only is there going to be an image of the beast issue associated with the siege. This is the siege, brothers and sisters. This is the destruction. This is the siege of Jerusalem. This is the destruction of Jerusalem. They're both connected. They're the beginning and the ending of the identical history. But this prophecy here is giving us two witnesses, because I'm not done reading Ezekiel. He's just did the 390 years from here to the siege for Israel. Now in verse 6 it says, and when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year. Therefore thou shalt set thy face towards the siege of Jerusalem. What's he doing? He's setting his face towards the siege of Jerusalem. The siege of Jerusalem is what's being emphasized here. And if you go from the siege of Jerusalem and you go back 40 years, you will be defining what the period of time that is given to Judah that leads to the siege. And it's 40 years. And for Israel, it's 390 years. And it brings you back here to 677, 627, which is where Josiah, and have given you that reference, fulfills this prophecy in 2 Kings 23, 15 through 18. Therefore, this reformation that is started by Josiah is the last call for both Israel and Judah. Right here. And this is pretty profound stuff. You go bust out your Bible commentaries, you're never going to find anyone that's ever put this together. This is something that was put together within the past year. All right. There's other things to say about that. Let me give you the references, and I want to move away from this because I want to get to Hosea. I gave you the reference for the siege, Ezekiel 587, Ezekiel 24, verses 1 and 2. 587, Ezekiel 24, verses 1 and 2. And the destruction of Jerusalem is Ezekiel 24, verses 15 through 24. And let's read verse 24. Ezekiel 24, verses 15 through 24, is the destruction of Jerusalem. And you got to read the whole chapter 24 if you want to get there's another characteristic here in chapter 24 that I'll just throw out there. Before Ezekiel gets to the verses I pointed you to, the Lord tells Ezekiel, I'm going to strike down your wife, she's going to die, and you're not going to mourn for her. I don't want no tears for her. And that very evening, he strikes down his wife, and she dies, and he's not allowed to mourn for his wife. And then it goes right into this prophecy that the desire of his heart was his wife, but the desire of Israel's heart was Jerusalem, and it's going to get destroyed. And they're not going to be able to mourn for it because they're going to go into captivity. So he gives an object lesson at the beginning of this chapter that tells you that the woman is going to die in this history. Okay, this here, when she is destroyed, it's a church getting passed by. She's dead. Okay, that's another part of the story. But in verse 24 of chapter 24, when this comes to a conclusion, you need to read this all on your own. It says, Thus Ezekiel is a sign unto you, according all that he hath done shall ye do, and when this cometh ye shall know that I am the Lord God. The prophet in this history is a sign as well. Okay, just keep that in mind. But now that I burn up half my time, let's jump forward. What I'm saying is, there's all kinds of things to say about this, all right? What I'm doing, if you're not following the logic, is I'm just taking this waymark of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, and I'm building some of the characteristics that we should expect to find in that from the various lines where the sieges are taken up. This is a matter of public record. Everything we've done so far is a matter of public record. Where we'll go to now might be a little bit new for you, so this is where you may want to put your thinking caps on. Did I give you all those references? 586, the city is smitten. 586 is Ezekiel 33:21. Sorry, I didn't give you that reference. And I'll read that for you, because there's another characteristic. This is the destruction of Jerusalem. Someone's going to come from Jerusalem to tell Ezekiel the city was taken. Where's Ezekiel? Is he in Judah? Is he in Jerusalem? No, he's in Babylon. So someone's got to come and tell him that Jerusalem's destroyed. And in Ezekiel 33:21 it says, "And it came to pass in the 12th year of our captivity, in the 10th month, in the 5th day of the month, that one that had escaped from Jerusalem came unto me, saying, The city is smitten. Now the hand of the Lord was upon me in the evening, afore he that was escaped came, and had opened my mouth, until he came to me in the morning, and my mouth was open, and I was no more dumb." Jerusalem's destroyed, and the prophet, who's a sign, is no more dumb. You know any other people that are no more dumb at this point here? Zechariah. Okay, this is the second witness to the no more dumb, but what's it telling you and me? That this prophet here is a sign. He's got a message to give here. Whether this be the midnight cry, the Sunday law, or the conclusion of it all. I don't know what kind of message you'd have at the close of probation, but that's the logic. Okay, so now, let me drop down to the siege of Hoshea. Go to 2 Kings. We'll read some things here. 2 Kings, chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. And let me remind you where... Do you need this stuff? You don't need this part, at minimum. Where I'm going with this before we start on this is that I'm understanding that the French Revolution is repeated in our history. I'm even understanding that Trump has been typified by Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay? So in order to put all those pieces together and uphold them with 2 or 3 witnesses, for me it's important to see that 1789 is actually a waymark of Bible prophecy. Okay? And the American Revolution begins in 1774, and the French Revolution ends in 1799. And how long was the French Revolution? The historians tell us it was 10 years. From 1779. Yeah, Ellen White has... This is the thing about it. This history here of the French Revolution, once you begin pulling the lines together, you'll see it's similar to what we're understanding the effect of every vision. There are several balls in the air in this history. Okay? 1779. 89. 1799 is the history of the French Revolution as given by the historians. I don't have a problem with that. We can do with 10. Okay, so you got 10 years here. Hoshea is going to show us 9 years in this history. Hoshea is going to take us to 1798. Why? Everyone in this room should know why. Because in 723, you have the beginning of the 2520 that ends when? In 1798. Okay? So Hoshea is the one that's taken captive here, and he's typifying when the papacy's taken captive here, right? That's an easy one to see if you believe that Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning. How long did Hoshea reign? 9 years. Okay, from here to here. I guess this would be 732 BC, going backwards. If there's a 9-year period that leads to the captivity of Hoshea in 723, and that's the history associated with the beginning of the 2520, then the capture of the papacy in 1798 should have a 9-year period preceding it, because Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning. And what is 9 years from 1798? 1789. we have a witness now, one witness on 1789 being a point of reference in Bible prophecy. And what happened in 1798 in the United States? The Constitution is put in place, all right? So is the Constitution, does that mean anything in prophetic symbolism in terms of the United States? Yes, brothers and sisters. The characteristic that we all know in this room about the United States in Revelation 13:11 is it's going to do what? It's going to speak as a dragon. And the speaking of a nation is an action of its legislative and judicial authorities. Okay? So, who was the first president of the United States? No, George Washington was not the first president of the United States. He was the 17th president of the United States. Okay? But it's about the Constitution. Okay? The revolution begins in 1774. And they set up a group of people that are getting ready to break away from Britain. And it's not until 1781 that they speak. In 1781, the government of the United States, the newly formed government, but a government, brothers and sisters, a government is not a government without a constitution. It's just a group of men sitting around theorizing. You have to have a constitution. And in 1781, they introduced the Articles of Confederation, which is pretty much the same as the Constitution, but there are some important differences. And from here to here, you have 7 presidents of the United States. They're really just, initially, I think 9 colonies, but you get my point. The 7th one becomes the first, the 7th of these initial presidents becomes the first of the presidents that will lead to the 1789, to the introduction of the Constitution. Here's where they speak again in 1789. And between here, this 7th president, he becomes the first president that has a constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And there's going to be 9 more. There's going to be a total of 10 presidents in here, a total of 16 actually. 6 here, but the 7th of this history that has no constitution is also the first president of those that have a constitution, the Articles of the Confederation, that are going to become the Constitution in 1789, and then George Washington is going to become the first president, like you all said, all right? Well, I just wanted you to see, because you know that Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning, that technically these presidents weren't really presidents because they didn't have a constitution. But these 10 presidents were. They had a constitution. Okay, so what I'm saying is, among other things, the last president of the United States, he's going to turn it all over to the 10 kings. So the last president is followed by 10 kings, just like the first president was preceded by 10 presidents. Okay, I don't think that's an accident. I don't think that's an accident that this all begins in 1774 and it comes to its conclusion down here in 1799, 25 years later. And there's 2 revolutions that take place. And the difference between the 2 is that France had thrown away its opportunity to be the glorious land. And it was reaping the results of rebellion in the French Revolution. It couldn't have invented it, even if it had a perfect constitution, it was all over for them. They were at the end. They were reaping the punishment of being the place where the martyrdom of the Protestant Reformation began, and where it illustrates what happens to the glorious land that is being raised up in that time period when they get to the end of their history. The French Revolution is repeated. And we have this history of 25 years where this is encapsulated for us to think about. So I want you to see Hosea now And this is the reason. There are arguments now coming up about the French Revolution and the American Revolution that are so profound about what's about to take place in the very near future that you got to see it. You just got to see it. So in 2 Kings 17, 1 through 6, 2 Kings 17, 1 through 6. It says, 2 Kings. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, began Hoshea, the son of Eli, to reign in Samaria over Israel 9 years. Okay, so he's going to reign for 9 years, and he's going to be taken into captivity in 723. So what I'm saying is, scriptures are telling us that the reign of Hoshea, that is a subject of prophecy, we've already accepted. He's the one that starts the 2520. It's preceded by 9 years. My argument is that when it comes to a conclusion in 1798, it will be preceded by a period of 9 years that has been typified by this history here. Okay, so verse 2. And he did evil, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel that were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents. You got to pay attention to this part too, okay? And the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea. Why did he find conspiracy in Hoshea? Because Hoshea reached out to the king of Egypt and wanted to form an alliance with the king of Egypt to resist Hoshea. And what did resist Shalmaneser? And what did, in that period of time when Hoshea is trying to form an alliance with Egypt, what did he quit doing in connection with Assyria? He quit paying tribute. Okay, so what brings the problem, the real life and death problem, the siege upon Hoshea, is a taxation problem. Okay, so next verse. He found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no present to the king of Assyria. He quit paying his taxes. And as he had done year by year, therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it how many years? So this besieging here will also have a 3-year period. Okay? And what I'm saying is that there's going to be a 3-year period here. Okay? And I'm saying this 3-year period is marked by what Napoleon's going to do when he goes and delivers the deadly wound here. And you can pull that 3-year period out of the French Revolution, whether we will get there or not, but tonight, probably, most certainly not. But if you take 3 years from 1798, where do you get to? 1795, and in 1795 in France, they restored religious freedom, okay, and that had been taken away earlier in the French Revolution. So when they restore religious freedom, who's that in opposition to? The papacy. It begins a 3-year siege on the papacy that culminates down here with the Pope being taken captive and later dying in exile. Okay, so next quote. 2 Kings 18, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hosea, son of Eli, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Israel, began to reign. And then in verse 9 through 11 of the same passage, it says, now it came to pass in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of Hoshea. And what I want you to see here, if you will, these passages of Scripture are making sure that we understand the years of Hosea. This isn't a minor casual reference. It's nailing it down so we can be clear about what it's representing. Son of Elah, king of Israel, that Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. And at the end of 3 years, they took it. Even in the 6th year of Hezekiah, that is the 9th year of Hosea, king of Israel, Samaria was taken. And the king of Assyria did carry Israel unto Assyria and put them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gozan in the cities of the Medes. Okay? 2 Kings 17:4 is a reference to taxes. We've already touched on that. And let me drop down here. Okay, so I'm not going to try to pretend that I really understand this history, the little snippet of French Revolution. I'm still trying to grasp the history of the French Revolution. For some reason, I thought the French Revolution, the bloodbath, was a bunch of Christians that got killed. That isn't so. This was a retaliation against forces that weren't Christian. The Christians had been persecuted and driven out of France. Okay, there were still Christians there, but they estimate at the high point in that time period that the population of France that was Christian was 10%, but by the time of the French Revolution it was down to 6%. And if you pay close attention to the persecutions that take place beginning in 1773, it wasn't about the Christians. It was about cleaning up house, okay? The 3.5 years of Revelation 11, that they're going to be persecuted and then they're going to stand up on their feet, that was the war of the Vendees. Go look up from 1773, the bloodbath was primarily the war against the Vendees. Who are the Vendees? Okay, the Vendees were the Roman Catholics, sympathizers in France. And they were getting cleaned up on by the communists that were running the revolution. This is the birth of the King of the South. And the bloodbath of the 3.5 years that's referenced in Revelation 11, the majority of the people that were dying there were the ones that were protesting that the Catholic Church had been driven out of France and shut down. They were hardcore Catholics. And they were defeated 3.5 years later. They were cleaned up. So if you had that perception that the French Revolution was about the destruction of Christians, there's no doubt there was Christians killed there. But that wasn't what was going on. What was going on is the removal of, do they call it serfdom? Okay, that was being done away with in human history. When I started looking at this, I came across a website that had a very nice take on the French Revolution, but it was called the Anarchy File or something. So when you're reading this historical review, it's coming from people that believe the French Revolution was a glorious high point in Earth's movement towards a communist system. Okay, they're all pro. The French Revolution was good. Okay, that's what they're all about, and they're putting it in context. And the one point that they make that's valid is the French Revolution brought to an end the system of feudal rule. Okay, that was a good thing. But when you turned those peasants that had no education, you turned the government over to them, it was a bad idea, because now retaliation began. It began against the Catholics, and then the communists broke up into 3 factions, okay? And they began to battle against themselves. But it wasn't a Christian bloodbath, okay? So why I'm saying that is, brothers and sisters, when the crisis hits the United States, there's going to be no doubt some Seventh-day Adventists that are persecuted, some are going to die, they're going to go to jail. But the big bloodbath that's going to take place in the United States, you can see it already written on the wall. Okay, in the United States, already black people are coming up behind police officers and shooting them. Okay? And there's people in the United States that are claiming this is okay. All right? And there's never been so many weapons or bullets sold in the United States as in the past few years. Okay? And the people that are buying those guns aren't just black people. It's the so-called patriots. So you can see a country that's being divided. It's on the verge of a bloodbath, and it's not necessarily going to be about the Christians. It's going to be about the different factions. The Democrats against the Republicans, the patriots against whatever. And if you don't see that in the French Revolution, you may not see that that's about what is about to happen in the United States. Okay? So there's things to glean from this that really make sense when we know the spirit of prophecy said that during that time period, we should be out in the country and we can live like kings and queens, because this bloodbath, it's going to go on in the cities, primarily. Okay? Let me read this to you from which you've read before. Great Controversy 283. I'll close up on this thought and we'll take some of these up later. I was going to read you something about the directorate. I'll read you about the directorate because I was going to and I got myself sidetracked. Okay, the directorate is one of the names that they put upon the people running France during the French Revolution. February 21st, 1795, the convention, this is another word for this ruling body. The convention formally proclaimed the freedom of religion and the separation of church and state. They'd done away with religion. Sister White says in 1773, they forbid the Bible. They closed down religion. But in 1795, okay, February 21st, religion, freedom of religion and separation of church and state is restored. And brothers and sisters, the Catholic Church stand in opposition to the separation of church and state. It is the very essence of what the Catholic Church is the combination of church and state. So France has retaliated against Rome. It's retaliated against God. It's retaliated against the royalty in France. But it's reaping the results by 1795 that this isn't going right. So they restore the separation of church and state, and they restore freedom of religion. So this now is a new movement for them, but it's a movement that's directly in opposition to the Pope of Rome. And 3 years later, in February, 3 years later, the Pope is taken captive. That's this 3 years here, okay? That it's been typified by this 3 years here. But I'm going to drop down now to the spirit of prophecy to close this out. There is a point I never fully understood. Perhaps all of you already have. But she says this, Great Controversy 283. Unhappy France reaped in blood the harvest she had sown. The harvest that she had sown. Okay? This is the conclusion of something that they have been doing. Okay? This cause and effect. They had no way to get out of this situation. When I first started grappling with this for myself, I thought, well, you know, Thomas Jefferson is identified as the main guy that wrote the Constitution in the United States, and his best French friend is Lafayette, who writes the Constitution that they first introduced in France. So I think, wow, you know, maybe it's just both of two nations trying to introduce a constitution, and the one nation gets sidetracked, and the other nation is on the right course. But it isn't that. It's that France is reaping the harvest of its rebellion. It's illustrating the end of the glorious land. The glorious land is the two-horned country where the Lord took the gospel to protect and preserve it, and he did that with France also. Notice this. Unhappy France reaped in blood the harvest she had sown. Terrible were the results of her submission to the controlling power of Rome. Where France, under the influence of Romanism, had set up the first stake at the opening of the Reformation, there the Revolution set up its first guillotine. The first martyr of the Protestant Reformation marked the spot where the first death in the French Revolution was going to take place. And who's the first person that died? The King of France, on the very spot. So let me read that for you. See, what I'm saying is when inspiration is noting that for us, it's letting us know that this whole history of France is about the harvest that they were sown because they were given the opportunity to be the defenders of the gospel when the Protestant Reformation arrived, and they rejected it just as the United States has done. Okay? So let me go back to this. Where France, under the influence of Romanism, had set up the first stake in the opening of the Reformation, there the Revolution set up its first guillotine. On the very spot where the first martyrs to the Protestant faith were burned in the 16th century, the first victims were guillotined in the 18th. Okay, now that's page 283. But she just doesn't speak about it once in the Great Controversy. She speaks about it twice, maybe more than twice. I found only twice so far. This is on page 230. The gospel of peace, which France rejected, was to be only too surely rooted out, and terrible would be the results. On the 21st of January, 1793, 258 years from the very day. In the last paragraph, she said on the very spot. Now she's saying to the very day of the year that fully committed France to the persecution of reformers. 258 years after they began to persecute the reformers, to the very day, on the very spot, another procession with a far different purpose passed through the streets of Paris. Again, the king was the chief figure. Again, there were tumults and shouting. Again, there was heard the cry for more victims. Again, there were black scaffolds. And again, the scenes of the day were closed by horrid executions. Louis XVI, struggling hand to hand with his jailers and executioners, was dragged forward to the block and there held down by main force till the axe had fallen and his dissevered head fell on the scaffold. Nor was the king the only victim. Near the spot, 2,800 human beings perished by guillotine during the bloody days of the Reign of Terror. The Reformation, and that's what she says in the next paragraph, the Reformation has presented to the world an open Bible, unsealing the precepts of the law of God and urging its claims upon the consciences of people. Infinite love had unfolded to men the statutes and principles of heaven. God had said, "Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear of these statutes and say, surely this is a great nation, is a wise and understanding people." This was the heritage that France could have had if it had accepted the Protestant Reformation 258 years to the day earlier. Now it's reaping the harvest, but in so doing, it's illustrating what we all know France typifies, the end of the United States. But the end of France takes place right at the beginning of the United States. So at the beginning of the United States, you have two witnesses about the end of the United States. You have the beginning of the United States and the introduction of the Constitution and the presidents. And you have the end of the glorious land that was France, that is also typifying the end of the glorious land, which is the United States. Okay, and this includes the understanding of the siege that takes place in here. So, if nothing else tonight, I'm hoping you're seeing that when it comes to putting the sequence of events in place at the end of the world in connection with the effect of every vision from 1989 to the close of probation, and 1989 is how many years after 1789? I don't think it's an accident that it's 200 years right on the nose. Okay, but maybe it is. You know, I'm not going to argue that one. I don't have a second witness for it. That 1789 to 1989, 200 years. United States given the same privilege, they're on the verge of reaping the same results. And those two prophetic lines, the French Revolution and the beginning of the United States, get plugged in to our history. And the history of this one, I'm going to just say this in closing. The history of the American Revolution begins in 1774. The French Revolution ends in 1799. That's 25 years. Where do you plug these double revolutions in? Well, probably from midnight to the midnight cry, and then from the midnight cry to the Sunday law, and onward. Brothers and sisters, we're on the verge of Sister White says no human pen can describe what's about to take place. And there's very few people on planet Earth that are studying these things or understanding these things. You follow the logic? You and I are privileged. But not only are we privileged, we have a responsibility. Okay, we have a responsibility to bring these truths into our experience. So when, as Brother Tabot was saying, we're confronted with these false witnesses and this arrest and attack, that we can glorify the Lord. Right? That's what it's all about, getting our life prepared to do that. But I want to give you fair warning. There's only a few of us on planet Earth that are studying these things and following these things. Do you think Satan is not making an exerted effort right now to undermine this light? Because I'm here to tell you that if you're not seeing it, then that's fine if you're not seeing it. But there's still ongoing attacks against this message taking place around planet Earth. And it's got, in some ways, even more sinister here recently than ever before. And everyone needs to take and put on their spiritual thinking caps, because we're on the verge of a crisis that we can't describe, but we can see enough of it from the prophetic word that it's going to be horrible. And we have to be standing up on the truth, and our life has to be in agreement with the truth. Brothers and sisters, it don't matter if you know the truth if your life isn't exemplifying that truth. But we need to have the discernment now to recognize that the attacks only increase from here on out, from every direction. I'll try to add some more to that tomorrow, Lord willing. Shall we pray? Heavenly Father, you have been speaking to us through your prophetic word and through sacred history and even secular history. To those of us that are willing to hear, it is clear that you are about to raise up the church triumphant, that you're about ready to fully pass by the covenant people that you entered into covenant with in the 1850s, 40s and 50s. And that it's a tremendous crisis in the world and in the church that's about to take place. And that you've given us the privilege to be among those people that end up being the wise priests that enter into midnight and glorify your name. But we have a work to do individually and corporately. We need your spirit. We need your guidance. We need a consecration that we haven't had here before this time. And we ask that this Sabbath would be a point in each of our experiences where this kind of consecration and commitment would be taken up by each of us. I thank you for the light that you're opening up from the French Revolution and the history of the United States. And I ask that you continue to build upon this understanding for us tomorrow, that we can be edified and prepared for a tremendous crisis that's about to take place. As we part this evening, we ask for traveling mercies. We ask that you'd get us home quick enough that we can get some rest and come back tomorrow morning refreshed to take up further studies by Brother Tabo and myself. Thank you for all these things, for bringing us here this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.